There are just three types of blood vessels in the body. Um, Two of them are pictured here in the picture below, but the other one is too tiny to be at this magnification. I also wanted you guys to just look at all of the different things that you see in this picture, like the adipose tissue and some other connective tissue around it. There's some good stuff here. So there are arteries. They're usually very nice and plump and juicy and round, like this artery right here. And they tend to have a lot of smooth muscle because they do a lot of contracting. And a certain type of artery called an arteriole controls blood pressure. Over here on the right, we have a vein. And veins don't retain their shape very well because they don't have a lot of smooth muscle, although they do have smooth muscle. And you can also see that the vein is not full of blood, right? There's a big open space here that's not full of blood, whereas the artery is completely full of blood. So arteries in the systemic circuit or the body circuit carry blood away from the heart. Veins drain blood to the heart. That's only in the body or systemic circuit. And I want to make that point here because in this class, in this chapter in your book, when we say artery and vein, we're referring to those in your systemic circuit unless we say it's the arteries and veins that go to and from the lungs, which we'll consider separately. But for our purposes here, arteries, veins, systemic circuit. The third type of blood vessel is a capillary, which is very, very, very tiny, right? Even smaller than that nerve up there on the middle of the diagram, or even smaller than some of these adipose cells. So arteries, veins, and capillaries. In this video, we consider the general properties of arteries, veins, and capillaries. There's another video that considers the specific types of arteries, specific types of veins, and capillaries. By basic definition, blood vessels contain three tunics. I taught in another class, and these were just called layers from another book. So a tunic is usually a shirt that's kind of long. Many times tunics can have a little bit of a collar around them, so that's why we get tunics. So it's like wearing a couple sweaters. There are three tunics. The tunica externa, which is obviously the outermost ring of a blood vessel. There's the tunica media, which always consists of that smooth muscle right there. And then there's the tunica interna, which is what comes into contact with all of your little red blood vessels. Any vessel, artery, vein, capillary, can have all of or only one of these tunics. So we're going to find that a capillary doesn't have a tunica externa or media. So by definition, it doesn't have those two, but it has the internal one. These tunics are obviously different in the different vessels. Looking at the picture over on the right, you can see that there is much more tunica media in the artery than there is in the vein. So now we can associate tunica media with smooth muscle, because that's true in arteries and veins. The tunica media is composed of smooth muscle, which is under involuntary control, right? Right now, constrict all of your blood vessels. Yeah, you can't do that. The tunica externa is the outermost layer, and it's really its main purpose is to attach the blood vessels to surrounding tissue. And this is a picture here of a vein, but I want you to know that there is a pretty hefty tunica externa in your arteries too. Think about where your aorta is, right? Descending, right in the middle of your abdomen and thoracic cavity. So it needs to be attached. It can't like move freely like a pipe that's not attached to the wall as it pumps. So there's lots of collagen in the tunica externa of arteries securing it to the tissues around it. There is collagen in the tunica externa of veins. There's just not as thick of a layer. There can be elastic fibers in smooth muscle in the tunica externa of veins. The elastic fibers are different than the collagenous fibers because they allow for stretch. So arteries were securing it to surrounding structures, veins were allowing for stretch. And that has something to do with how we viewed in the other picture that veins are only so full. We'll talk about that in more detail. I couldn't find a picture of this that I liked, but there's something called the vaso vassorum. I just love this term. It's the vessel of the vessels. So basically, you've got some veins and even some arteries, like the aortas, that are very enormous. And, the smooth muscle that surrounds them doesn't take from the blood that's flowing through them. So it doesn't take red blood cells and take the oxygen from those. The blood vessels are so large that they have their own blood vessels serving them. And that's this picture over here on the left that's in another language that I do not know. But what it's showing you here is that this vessel is so large that it has to have its own network of vessels serving it, thus the vessel of the vessels. The tunica media, as we said, the first thing that you have to think of tunica media is smooth muscle, and it's sheets of smooth muscle. I don't know if you remember this from Bio 171, but smooth muscle is an individual cells, right? Smooth muscle is a sheet of spindle-like cells that are kind of attached to each other, and yes, they do all contract in unison. In the smooth muscle or the tunica media, of very large arteries, you have what are called elastic lamina. And that's what you can see here in this diagram on the right, these black squiggly lines. Again, I don't know if you remember from Bio 171, we had elastic connective tissue, and it looked like a tube top because it had all of these dark squiggly lines. So the tunica media can have an elastic lamina that separates it from the tunica externa. And that's what we call here the external elastic lamina. The tunica media is very, very thick in arteries. In fact, the artery, your aorta, which takes the largest amount of pump pressure from the heart, the aorta has a very thick sheet of smooth muscle. It's not that the aorta contracts, it doesn't, but it can retain its shape. And to do that, it needs a lot of smooth muscle to retain its shape against the pumping pressure of the heart. The tunica media is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So that means that you have a brain and then a little brain and a spinal cord. And what it means is that the fibers that serve this, the neurons that serve this smooth muscle, come from the brain, descend the spinal cord, and follow tracks to the smooth muscle that are in the sympathetic nervous system. So yes, when you enter fight or flight, all of your blood vessels constrict, squeezing blood into your skeletal muscle. And that's this picture right here. Going from A to B here, B is vasoconstricted. And that's what happens when you're like, ooh, and you get frightened, and your sympathetic nervous system says, run away, and you get vasoconstriction. This over here in picture C, this is vasodilation. This is what happens with epinephrine. No, I'm sorry. This is what happens in an allergic reaction, which is counteracted by epinephrine. Sorry. Vasodilation is characteristic of anaphylactic shock. Basically, all of your vessels vasodilate and all the blood seeps into your tissues. That's not good. It needs to go into your heart. So, like I just said, the tunica media, its basic purpose is to cause vasoconstriction, and that can make the vessel smaller, but we also know that in the aorta close to the heart, vasoconstriction just helps the aorta retain its shape. Which vessel here has a higher blood pressure? This is normal, A. This here is a very high blood pressure. And we can relate this to knowing that people who have high blood pressure sometimes have stress problems. They sense that they're in stress and their body thinks they're under attack, and thus they have a sympathetic response and they pop a high blood pressure. The tunica intima is the layer of cells that comes into contact with all of the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, all the stuff in your blood. That's the tunica intima. Students usually look at this picture down here on the left, and they usually say like, oh, this dark squiggly line here is the tunica intima. It is not. You can't really even see the tunica intima on that picture there. Remember, we said dark squiggly lines, though, are elastic tissue. Your book has been calling the tunica intima the endothelium. It's basically like the connected inner liner of all of your blood vessels. Think for a moment, like close your eyes, think of the body, think of the circulatory system, and now think of the lining of the heart being continuous with your aorta. And then as your aorta branches into all of the vessels in your body, the endothelium is continuous into all of your vessels. So this term endothelium, your book has been using it like you knew what it was. The endothelium of the tunica intima is one layer of squamous-shaped cells. So we would say that it's simple squamous epithelia. This is the same kind of lining we saw in the lungs. Remember that squamous cells are like egg-shaped, like, oops, sorry, let me draw that in blue. They're egg-shaped like this. Right? And squamous cells, what they do is they line up like this around a blood vessel. And that's what forms the tunica interna. The purpose of the tunica interna, I'm sorry, your book calls it the tunica intima. Sorry about that. You know what? Either one, doesn't matter. You know what I'm talking about. The one that touches the blood. Its purpose is to reduce friction. You don't want your blood flowing along a blood vessel and going tap, 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 tap along the outside of the blood vessel. The purpose is that your little red blood cells flow smoothly. You don't want your little red blood cells going like this because that introduces friction, which is also resistance, which can contribute to blood pressure. The black squiggly line is called the internal elastic lamina. Remember from the other picture about veins, we called this the external elastic lamina. This is the internal, and it does not touch the blood. The internal elastic lamina is just one thread of elastic fiber, right superficial to the endothelium. This picture here on the right, on the bottom, is a really good picture. It shows you the tunics in an artery. It shows you how they're different here in a vein. Look at this capillary down here. This capillary is just a layer of simple squamous epithelium. That's all. It doesn't have any smooth muscle. It doesn't have the other tunics. Remember I said in the beginning, its definition is that it doesn't have a tunica media or a tunica externa. And the reason is because at the capillaries, this is where we exchange substances. This is where oxygen gets off in the systemic vessel, and this is where carbon dioxide gets on. This is where we leak glucose and anything else like hormones that the blood needs. So we don't want a long way to travel. We want these things that are in the blood to go very, very quickly through these walls here, right? We don't want too much resistance. Veins can come together. Your book, I think it mentions these in some place. I'm not really sure which one, where though. But veins have anastomoses, and this is what is called an interconnection of vessels. You can see this on this, I don't know, this hand is like disturbing. It's the nails, and this person is horribly dehydrated. But you can see the interconnection of vessels here. It's really common around your joints, like your elbows or your knees. Bend your elbow. As you do that, some arteries are becoming pinched, and therefore the blood takes other routes to get to the tissues in the lower part of your hand and your wrist, right? So as you pinch some arteries, others get used. And that's why we have this interconnection of vessels. It's kind of like side streets, right? As the main highway gets clogged or unusable, cars start to flow around the main highway. So you can see these. This is a picture of the systemic circuit. And it's a good picture because it has kind of everything in it. Note the red and blue colors, right? We're aware of the red color over here. That means arteries. That's carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart. Over here we have veins. Those are part of the venous system, and they're carrying deoxygenated blood back to the heart. So we've got a clockwise flow here. What you might have missed, though, that your book and every other book does use is purple. And purple is where we're exchanging the components of blood with the tissues around it. So this is where oxygen, glucose would be getting off into the tissues, and waste products would be getting on from the tissues. Now, the problem is that too much gets off and not enough gets back on. So think about this. The substances that leave the capillaries, not all of them get back on to the veins. And there's basically some stuff that's left in the surrounding tissues. What does that do? Just stay there? No, that's called edema. It is. But what happens is that you have like another drainage system. So this fluid does not build up in the tissue. Even though it's not all reclaimed by the veins, it doesn't build up in the tissue because you have these green vessels here. Oh, I don't want to do that. That hides them. But you have these green vessels here, and what they do, they're called lymph vessels, and they suck up that excess fluid. And then they all come together and they dump out into the subclavian vein, which is right up here by the heart. So this is how the excess fluid doesn't stay in your tissues. Now, people who are kind of at the end with congestive heart failure, kidney problems, there's a lot of things that can lead to edema. But edema is when the tissues are swelling. So this excess fluid doesn't drain into the lymphatic system. This excess fluid stays in the tissue and causes a swelling of the area. And of course, that can happen in one area, or as in congestive heart failure and some other conditions that can happen in all areas.